Lance book, when the DM first edition came, I still remember in that one paragraph on temporal arthritis. He writes, if you suspect temporal arthritis, strongly start steroids and confirm the diagnosis. And he cites an example. He suspected, he wanted to start establish diagnosis and start steroids. The next day, patient developed blind ischemic optic neuropathy.
Yeah, Professor Rod, good evening, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Hi.
Hi, Rod.
Yeah, I think Professor Peter has joined. Good afternoon.
Yeah, hi. I had this link from Dr. Ravishankar, so unfortunately the naming is not as accurate as it could be.
Welcome, Peter. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Peter, we might be able to fix it. Chandrasekhar, can we change
Sure.
Professor Godsby's name to...
It will be done, sir. Just a minute. We'll be just doing.
Thank you very much. Peter, what I'm hoping to do is to run a very short video segment from David Burke Lance interview, few minutes. And then I got a live video clip of you delivering the first oration at Western Health few years back. So we'll run that for a few minutes and then we'll introduce once the official process begin. Is that okay with you?
Fine and dandy. Cheers.
So the plan is I will make the introductory remarks and introduce Tisa, then we'll hand over to Tisa, and Tisa will introduce Professor Peter, and then you can run the video and invite Professor Peter to give a talk. So that is the plan.
Ishram, do you want to send a separate link directly to Peter from your end?
No, he said he will change the name.
Oh, that's done. Yeah.
All done.
Shankar, good evening.
Good evening, JMK.
Professor Marian, good evening, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Dr. Meshram.
So, everyone is quiet today. Dr. Meshram, you think it's time?
Yeah, I think we can start now. Bhavesh, is it okay we start?
Yes, sir, we can start.
So, good evening, at least it's evening here. Dear friends and colleagues, it's always such a great pleasure and an honor to be here and just simply listen to the wonderful accounts of really phenomenal lives of some of our neurological fathers and forefathers, if I may say, or people who laid the path for us to follow. So I think in this entire series, we heard some really excellent and phenomenal lectures, and all credit to Professor Meshram, who has done all the hard work in getting these together, looking after so many things, making sure that the right people speak about the right kind of persons, and the inspiration just flows along. So thank you, Dr. Meshram. The floor is entirely yours for introducing the subject today and introducing the speaker also today. And I have very fond memories when I was training in Queen Square, and this is for the speaker today. And I actually, when someone amongst the residents and the fellows at Queen Square told me that you must attend Professor Godsby's bedside. So I thought in mind, what is a bedside about headache going to? But I think after having attended his grand round or bedside, I thought he's a wonderful teacher, and he made the subject so interesting and so alluring. I think we are in for a great treat, but I leave it to Dr. Meshram to give a formal introduction of the speakers and the chairpersons for today's talk. Dr. Meshram, please.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gagandeep. Dear friends, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Tropical and Geographical Neurology Specialty Group of World Federation of Neurology and Indian Academy of Neurology have come together to organize this very important and innovative series inspiring people in neurosciences. In this series, we will learn about legends who have done great work in the field of neurosciences. The idea is to stimulate younger generation to do outstanding work in the field of their choice. Today, we are into the 7th session, and I welcome you all for this session. Inspirational person today is Professor James Waldo Lance, fondly known as Jim. His contribution to headache medicine is immense. He is known for an astute and detailed history taking and elegant physical examination. And to talk about this inspirational person, today we have Professor Peter Godsby, who was trained in neurology by Professor James Lance. Warm welcome to you, sir. To chair this session, we have Professor Tisa Vijayaratne. Professor Tisa is Director, Department of Neurology and Stroke Services, Victoria, Australia. He is Editor-in-Chief, Neurology International, MDPI. He is Chair, Advocacy, Public Awareness and World Brain Day, World Federation of Neurology. Professor of Neurology, Director, Academic Medicine and International Affairs, Department of Medicine, Western Health, Melbourne Medical School. He's Chair of Annual Marsden Movement Disorder Symposium, and it is the 5th year. He's a founder and chair of Lance Godsby Mind, Movement, Migraine and More Annual Symposium since 2018. He has publications of 242 papers and 56,000 citation. That is something great. And he has supervised 322 national and international trainees. He has various interests. He's a very active person and very quick to communicate. And apart from headache, he has interest in Parkinson's disease, movement disorders, and neuro rehabilitation. And for his active interest, also in public education and awareness, he received 12 international awards, and that is a big achievement. Welcome, Professor Tisa. We also have distinguished faculty to share the memories and their days with Professor James Lance. And I would like to welcome the invited panelists. Some have joined and few more will join. Professor David Burke, who is Professor Emeritus, Central Clinical School, University of Sydney. Professor Alexander Jagomi, Professor Prince of Wales Hospital, Australia, and founder member of Headache Society of Australia. Professor David Dokic, Professor of Neurology at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and past President of International Headache Society. Professor Anand Shirkathiachon from Thailand. Professor Matthew Kernan, Brazil Chair of Neurology, University of Sydney, and Director, Discovery and Translation, Brain and Mind Center. Professor Pamela McCombo from University of Queensland and past President of Australia and New Zealand Association of Neurology. We also have in the room join Professor Stephen Davis. He is Professor of Neurology, University of Melbourne and past President, World Stroke Organization. Professor Jeffrey Donan, Professor of Neurology, University of Melbourne. And Professor Gerald Edmonds, who joined, he is Professor of Neurology, University of Sydney, and a past CEO of Brain Foundation, which was started by Professor Jim Lance. Professor Richard Stark, Treasurer of WFN. Professor Regina McEltull, Professor of Neurology, Asian Hospital and Medical Center, Philippines. And Professor Dade Gunawan from Indonesia. I would also like to welcome certain distinguished personalities who are present in the room. Professor Raj Shakir, who is past president of WFN. Professor Yuji Kazi, first vice president of WFN. Professor Wolfgang Grisold, Secretary General of WFN. And Professor Louis Kaplan, who is Professor of Neurology at University of Boston. And we have Professor Marian Visser, WFN trustee and President of Indian Academy of Neurology, Professor J.M.K. Murthy, Professor Kalyan Bhattacharya, Professor Marco Medina, who is Secretary General of Tropical and Geographical Neurology of World Federation of Neurology, and all others. I would like to extend a warm welcome. And before I hand over to Professor Tisa, I'd like to announce that the next session on 4th September will be on Professor Theodore or Minsart or Ted Munsart, and the talk will be given by Professor Marco Medina, and other distinguished faculty will join that session. So block your date for 4th September. Over to you, Tisa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Meshram, the dear distinguished faculty, the distinguished speaker, Professor Peter Goadsby, and all of you are warmly welcome, as my colleagues mentioned, and my sincere gratitude for the organizing committee for selecting the late Professor James Lance, who is indeed the father of neurology in Australia, and also inviting myself to chair, and then selecting Professor Peter Goadsby, without a doubt, the best student that Professor Jim Lance produced out of a whole variety of similar the minds that he donated to the world. But out of them, probably the pinnacle is Professor Peter Goadsby. If I could have Peter's slide on CV, please. I've known Professor Goadsby for some time, and his story is a remarkable story. We could literally do an inspiring people session on Peter Goadsby himself, but I would strongly encourage you to read his biography on the book that we put out with First Lance Goadsby Symposium if you wanted to know more. I will produce a digital version of this book for the 4th Lance Goadsby Symposium, which is due in a few weeks' time. So Professor Peter Goadsby is the Professor of Neurology at King's College, London. He is the current President, American Headache Society. He is a past President, International Headache Society. As you all probably know, he is one of the 4 neuroscientists to be awarded with the 2021 Brain Prize, which is regarded as the world's most prestigious the award for brain research, not only the prestige, but the monetary value also. So he's a super rich person now. His major research interests are in basic mechanisms of primary headache disorders. And there isn't a headache type that his hands or brain hasn't touched over the years, basically generating almost close to 2,000 papers with an unbreakable H index of 142 and citation almost hitting 100,000, as you can see. Most of all, if you look at the program behind me, you would see Professor Lance on the left corner. And if I move to the other side, you would see on the right-hand side, Professor Peter Goadsby. And you could see my face below them. In a way, this represents almost 3 generations of neurology in Australia, although you might argue that you don't look Australian. Everybody recognize me as a Sri Lankan neurologist, but I call Australia and many other countries home, as you all know. So the Peter is basically responsible for resurrecting headache medicine field in Australia. I remember, although Australia produced Professor Jim Lance, although Australia produced Professor Peter Goadsby, for a long period of time, there wasn't much activities in headache medicine in Australia. Then out of nowhere, somewhere close to 2013, I received an email to attend a headache master class or headache masters program in Tokyo, which I later realized that was totally manipulated by Professor Goadsby. Then he helped us and mentored us immensely to resurrect Headache Society, which is flying very high now with a whole lot of academic activities, as many of you are aware. And he also wholeheartedly supported us to set up Lance Goadsby Symposium, which has now become an international meeting, as we hosted 900 delegates last year virtually, mostly coming from India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Asia-Oceania region. And this year, when we launch it in a few weeks' time, I'm pretty sure that we would pass the mark 1,000 delegates, as it would be free. And already we have like 60 the nice talks collected. So before I invite Professor Goadsby to the podium, let me share a small video clip with you. The video clip would have a short segment of interview with late Professor Jim Lance by Professor David Burke, courtesy of the producers in Australia. Thank you for allowing us to use that video clip. The Professor Lance himself gave that video to me to use at the first Lance Goadsby Symposium also. And then I also hijacked the small video clip of Professor Goadsby about to deliver the inaugural James Lance Medal and Oration in 2018 when the Professor Lance was alive. I hope you would enjoy that, and then we'll invite Professor Goadsby to do the talk. Let me share my screen. Professor Sagami, warm welcome to you. You are just joining us, as I can see. Can you all see the video all right?
Yes, yes.
All right.
Career. Can you tell us about some of your highlights?
Well, it's been a great pleasure and pride over the
Can you hear his voice?
I've described already how your own work has led to this development of an institute, how our headache work has led to Peter Goadsby being outstanding in his field. Many others in the motor field, Peter Ashby, whom you know well, was a professor in Toronto. And right throughout the world, there are people like Tassolari in Bologna in Italy, who came to us from Gasto in Marseille, Mike Welsh, who came from London, but then from the UK, from Houston. We've got sort of scattered representatives, so to speak, in different parts of the world who have become outstanding in their own right. And there's an enormous sense of pleasure and pride.
As well as showing insight into the black box that the brain was when I graduated.
Well, I think you and I have been very lucky to spend our lives in a field like neurology, which has not only been an intellectual stimulation, has been such a source of pleasure. And I'm still working part-time and still derive enormous pleasure from doing so.
It's a very generous introduction, most of which was inaccurate, except the bits that Jim Lance said, which are, of course, axiomatically correct. I'm struck today, it's a privilege to, I'll move on to the talk in a moment. I was struck maybe 5 years ago when I met Tisa and David Dodig and I, in the International Headache Society, in our role, wanted to give Southeast Asia a bit of a boost. And so with Fumihiko Sakai, we arranged a teaching course, a masterclass in Japan. And we sought to, I particularly wanted to drag some people across from Australia and try and kickstart, I think, more or less, let me do it in the Western way, cattle prod. The Australian Headache Society back into action. And Tisa must have got... Oh, that's bad. My son wants to do obstetrics. I don't understand it really, because people call you up and you have to go. One of the things I like about neurology is a little, got a little bit of time. Tisa jumped more with the cattle prod than anybody else and has done more to rejuvenate the Australian Headache Society than anyone else who came to the meeting. And it's extraordinary. It's fantastic. I'm also struck, I have to say, I'm struck the support that he has from very high levels in his institution. I'm totally struck the chief executive officers here. If you could stop the recording for a minute, I haven't met my chief executive officer. I'm not sure I'd recognize the guy. I mean, sorry, he's got the chief executive officer here and he knows who he is. Good Lord. I mean, I'm sorry for saying that, but it's fantastic. It's fantastic to see the way that you've coordinated the university and the hospital side here. You take it seriously. For God's sake, I wish more people would do that. So congratulations to all three of you for doing that. And thank you. As you said, you asked me to talk about the CGRP story, calcitonin gene-related peptide, in the context of the Lance oration. And so I'm going to say a few things about Jim Lance. This is a pretty meaningless slide. I was doing a talk in Los Angeles and Breaking Bad was really cool back then. And so I wanted to show them that I could get with the program, so to speak. And I realized migraine's not spelt properly. Okay. Neurologists tend to point that sort of thing out. Just go with the flow. It's not too bad, really, you have to say. It took me hours to do this during a couple of meetings that were pretty useless. I was sitting there doing that, looking intense, of course, as one does. So it's just, I like to use it on as many occasions as I can. Say a few words about Jim Lance for those of you who who aren't familiar with this is a picture, obviously. Jim graduated in 1950. Whoa, from the University of Sydney, did his MD in 55, and then went by boat, as they did then, to London to work at the National Hospital for a year, and went back to Australia, and then went as a fellow to Mass General to work with Raymond Adams. They wrote a number of papers. The one that you'd be familiar with is in the neurology sphere would be on post-hypoxic myoclonus, which those of you in the know would call Lance Adams syndrome, and other people would just call it post-hypoxic myoclonus. I prefer to call it Lance Adams syndrome. He won a number of awards, the Wolf Award of the American Headache Society, Arnold Friedman Award. He was president of the Australian Association of Neurologists and founding president of the Australian Headache Society and the president of the International Headache Society. Extraordinary career. He wrote 300 papers, more or less, but that was in the typewriter era. I mean, you know, it's not very hard these days. It's nice of you to say I've got published a few things, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist with EndNote to produce 100 references without thinking too much. Jim's secretary had to type them all. And of course, I felt sorry for it many occasions because he was prepared to edit as much as we are prepared to edit with our Word documents, but you had to go retype it every time. Extraordinary. He was doing research in the 60s on headache. I mean, it's unfashionable now in many medical schools to do that. In 1960, it's positively unheard of. He would see patients, he would teach students, he was a proper full-time academic, and he had an experimental laboratory in headache in the pre-triptan era. And you'll see you'll see here he was publishing until 2015. There's a common theme on this slide, which one of the great lessons I learned in terms of teaching and promoting people. And if you look here, yeah, it's coming up there. It's a sort of rogues gallery, you might say. This is Paul Spira, who's still in headache. This is Andrino Zagami, who's currently president, I think, of the Australian and New Zealand Headache Society. This is Michael Welsh, who was editor of Cephalalgia and president of the International Headache Society. This chap is now he's a vice dean of medicine in Bangkok. This is David Burke, ever grinningly happy. Aziz Sonawalla, who was, I think he's currently president of Pakistan Headache Society. This is Nick Bogduk, who wrote all of the really interesting work about the neck anatomy. And he looks rather innocuous. Peter Drummond, he wrote some of the really nice physiological work on cranial autonomic outflow, a perfectly wonderful experimental physiologist who developed all sorts of interesting ways of causing pain. Soapy water in the eye was one of his more popular ones. I mean, he looks like a guy who'd never hurt anybody, but he really did some wonderful experiments. And there's Jim out the front of all the troops with Michael Anthony. And the common thing that is in this is that Jim created an environment in which people were happy. Look at them all. They were happy, and they were happy to work hard. And if you get a proper environment, and I've seen it in your relationship with your junior staff already, they're happy. They're happy to come to work, and they value the environment. And I can see how your CEOs, you guys obviously have worked out that happy people work harder. And that's Jim obviously worked that out a long time ago. So it's a pleasure to, do I need to do iCloud? Oh, no, I'll forget about the iCloud.
So thank you for your attention. I selected that piece to remind ourselves that there was a pre-COVID time. There was a time that we used to travel. There was a time that we used to dress well for these sort of things. And I thought that Peter himself would have enjoyed this also. So without further ado, let's listen to Professor Peter Godsby, without a doubt the best student that Professor Jim Lance has produced, and obviously pushing us to run the headache-related things in this part of the world, and certainly in our region also. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, before Professor Peter starts, I would like to welcome Professor Jagami has joined. And we also have Dr. Ravi Shankar, my friend, headache consultant at Jasper Hospital. And he was responsible, actually. Ravi Shankar was responsible for reaching out to Professor Peter Goadsby. Thank you, Professor Peter.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tisa, for the quarterbacking that. You remind me of many things. One is that these days, if you're going to get videoed, you're going to expect that someone's going to replay it, including the bits that you may not wish to be replayed. But there's lots of complex things sometimes. I'm sure I'm not the best student that Lance ever produced, but I've been fortunate, and I'm certainly okay at making slides. So I'm pleased to speak about his life. I'm going to lean heavily on what David Burke has written, and he gave the eulogy at Jim's funeral, and wrote a piece in it's Australian Historical Archive. I'll give the reference as I get to that point. Thanks. I'm glad Ravi Shankar's on the line. It's been pivotal in Indian neurology, getting an interest in headache, and I see many other people that I've met over the years. I'm glad, and I'm glad that Sendrino Zagami has also gotten here, and I can't see all the other names, but I recognise a lot of people. I'm going to share some slides as you do. Here we are. Looks like it'll work. Hold on. Let's not do that. This looks good. I think I'm sharing slides. It looks like it. I'm going to leave them on this view. They go up, the whole thing goes a bit wonky if I put it on slide view because I've got an especially large monitor. So, but it seems like probably you'll be able to read it, and I'll say most of the things that are on here. It's an interesting series. This series, it puts you in perspective. Personally, when you see the sort of people that are being discussed, I noticed that Professor Kaplan, Lewis Kaplan's on the call, who talked about Miller Fisher. I have to say, I think of Lewis Kaplan as one of the inspiring people in neurosciences. So you kind of get in your place when, and he's the person who's talking. I watched David Marston's talk, and you get in your place. Peter Jenner did such wonderful work. Listening to Marston's talk was quite interesting. I will say one thing about the contrast between the two. You would not have sent a stripogram to a celebration or a round of Jim Lance's. That wouldn't have been a thing. It would have never even occurred to me to do that. And when I heard that they sent a stripogram to David Marston's celebration of his FRS, it reminds you that our inspiring people are very unique people indeed. And I see the other presentations, Professor Wadia, Professor Adams, Raymond Adams, who was quite an inspiration across and teacher across such a broad group of neurologists. And of course, John Newsom Davis, who died unfortunately too early. Well, there's never a good time to die, but it was rather unfortunate road accident, a traffic accident, I think. So this series puts you in your place. I see myself as simply pleased to have the opportunity to speak about Jim Lance, and of course, many of my colleagues are on the line and be welcome to say anything they like when I finished, of course. James Waldo Lance, named after his father, born 26 and died 2019. So lived to a healthy old age, shall we say. I'll talk about the various qualifications there and come back to some of them. For those of you who aren't, an MD is obvious, although you do it by research, so I'll make an emphasis of that. The CBE is commander of the British Empire when in the days when the Australian government offered an honours system that had the UK connections. AO is the Order of Australia, so that's the Australian honours system. For those of you from North America, the concept of an honours system may be kind of weird. It's the way that the sort of the British historically do things. They give you an honour rather than give you money. Life's a complex thing. Jim often said he had a number of daughters, so perhaps life was more complex because you pay for all the weddings. He was a fellow of the Australian College and the Royal College, and a fellow of the Australian Academy. That's like the Royal Society or the National Academy of Science in the US. I'll come back to each of those. So born October 29, 1926, I believe, and I'm indebted to what I read from David Burke's piece about this. Apparently born in the front room of his the family home by a forceps delivery, no less. At least he didn't compress his thinking very much. That was a bit weak and a bit droll. He's educated until boarding school early at age 7. That must have been really hard back in those days. I read that it was because he was allegedly had asthma. Who knows? I mean, the world's a complex. Things were complex back then, whatever the cause of asthma was. By age 12, he had an exhibition. That is to say, it's like think of it as a bursary to go to Geelong Grammar, which is a really premier school in Australia. And at age 14, because of the war, Second World War, he had to transfer to King's School, which is in Parramatta, which is in the west of Sydney. Actually, his father had been there, so I guess that wasn't too weird. He described going to Geelong as like being in Athens, and King's School is like being in Sparta. Apparently, Geelong was a little bit more, Geelong Grammar was a little more on the intellectual side, and King's was a little more interested in things physical. And I use that terminology. I wrote this deliberately because it's typical of the way Jim would explain something. He would never say that something was more intellectual than another. It's not really the way he would say it. But he was marvelous at saying something exact, but in a more, you might say, more educated fashion. So you have to understand a little bit about the difference between Athens and Sparta, understand the difference that he was drawing attention to. I always admired the way he would use words. He gave me and used them clearly and sparingly, but when necessary. He gave me a book after I think it was about the second paper I'd ever written that I'd given to him, which came back almost with no words that I'd originally written because they were mostly rubbish. He gave me a book, why not say it clearly, with a little bit of a message. I suspect that nothing I was writing was very clear at all. One of my other teachers at the time, Jeff Lambert, who was a PhD pharmacologist, studies pharmacology in Melbourne, did a postdoc in New York, and was working. He really introduced the animal electrophysiology to migraine research, which is spread around the world. My writing was so bad at the time that Jeff was correcting something on a bus, and some lady sitting next to him turned to him and said, because he had a lot of red marks, and turned to him and said that whoever has written that is going to cry when they see it. Well, I didn't cry, but one takes a lesson. So Jim went to university at the age of, that's college, I suppose, in US terms, at the age of 17, the University of Sydney. Where else would you go if you were Jim Lance? That's, I'm going to offend anyone not in New South Wales at the moment. I didn't go to the University of Sydney, by the way, but I think the University of Sydney at that time was certainly up there in the top couple of universities. I suspect the University of Sydney would think it was always the best university in Australia. These are the sort of discussions, of course, that get people excited. He did medicine in Australia, in the UK, and in the UK system, you could do medicine as an undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, MBBS. So he started doing that at the age of 17. That's the way I started medicine. So MBBS is a bachelor degree which entitles you to practice medicine. I'll come on to the MD in a little while. Graduated with honours, as you would expect. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Where would you go if you were Jim Lance training next? You would go to the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, because that was probably thought of as the academic hospital in Sydney at the time. And he was there as a junior resident medical officer, RMO, and a senior resident medical officer in 51st as a junior and 51 as a senior resident medical officer. It was unseemly, the work that the RMOs had to do. It was pretty bad when I was an RMO, but it was even worse then. The idea that you would need a day off if you worked overnight, it's just not a thing. Stuff like that was craziness. The idea that you wouldn't be available, that if the boss wanted to do around 5, 6 p.m., there was something called, there was any sort of sense of civilization in terms of the time, not a thing. It was a remarkable time in medicine, and I'm sure it wasn't correct, but it was anyone who's gone through that has a kind of feeling of a badge of merit, I suppose. It was like war, and Jim was very successful at it. I'll come back to the Northcott Neurological Centre shortly, and then go on to talk about research training. Jim was a classicist in this from this era. As discussed, I heard in the introduction talking about rounds that I was doing at the National. Lance's ward rounds were like that, but the Lance's ward rounds were a much more elaborate affair in many ways, because the Prince Henry Hospital where he was built for TB epidemic, I think, out on the coast, and they were all the wards were single story, and it was all flat. It was all laid out. There was in fact a golf course behind it. It was a wonderful, wonderful place. But yeah, and on a good day, it was a wonderful, wonderful place to do rounds. But you'd have to imagine that we would start in Ward 4, which was where the neurology was, and then sweep on foot through these 6 wards, through the hospital, and end up by about 1 o'clock, more or less, as you would, to have lunch in the cafeteria, which had sweeping 180-degree sweeping views of the Pacific Ocean and of the golf course in front of you, the Pacific Ocean. Beautiful, beautiful place. Now it's actually luxury condos. What isn't these days? Luxury condos. We would be walking around, and it'll be a long trail of people. Jim would be out the front, striding forward to the next ward to get things done. Extraordinary time, I have to say. And as it was mentioned, as a meticulous history taker, I remember once just feeling like I was about the size of a walnut, sitting in front of an elephant, when it was a stroke case, and I hadn't asked some I thought small point of history, but there we are, silly me. And Jim looked at me and he asked, and I know the answer. And I didn't feel, he never made you feel bad so much as you felt bad to disappoint him. And it was like that. I think that, again, part of the success was to motivate people to be better than they were, to try their best. And I remember to this day how I felt when I hadn't quite got all the history. And it's not an error I tried to repeat, I have to say, although, who doesn't make mistakes, and who of our students don't make mistakes, and making a point out of it doesn't help anybody. But making people want to be their best, that's the secret, one part of the secret sauce to getting a great outcome, I think. So he finished University of Sydney with MBBS honours. He did clinical training for 2 years, 50 and 51 general medicine training as it was. He went to do research with Peter Bishop, and I'll come back to that. And during that time, he was seeing patients with George Selby at the Northcott Neurological Centre. And they wrote, published some 10 years later, a paper called Observations on 500 Cases of Migraine and Allied Vascular Headache. And it really puts you in a little perspective about what a case series is. You know, you see things written where there were 3 cases or a single case or 5. Jim was a very serious person when it came to collecting cases. I mean, if there were only a few, there were only a few, but if there was lots available, well, there's lots available. One of the things a couple of things I pulled out of this, 2/3 of their patients had scalp tendons. So what? I mean, he was writing about allodynia 40 years before before colleagues in other places decided that they'd invented it. It was funny listening to one of my contemporaries, you might say, describing their discovery, more or less, of allodynia in migraine in about 30 patients, maybe 40. And that this was that there hadn't been previously described. At the time, PubMed didn't go back before 1966. So if you didn't know to look at these original papers, you wouldn't read something from 1960. And it was a kind of wry pleasure that I have to say, to point out that that allodynia had been described actually, and in fact Gowers talked about it. Jim left me his Gowers book, which he got when he was in Boston from a chap who'd got it when he was in London, and he actually left me the Gowers book and put some little post-its in it with pages he thought I should read, which I of course did because they were useful suggestions. Much of this, and I think part of the overall theme of these talks, is that the great observers, they might have used slightly different words, but they didn't miss very much. And if you think you've discovered something, Jim used to say you should go have a read with Gowers because he might have already read about it. I think the same thing applies to headache. If you think you've got a new idea, it might be worthwhile having a look at a lot of the work that Jim Lance did, and you might find that actually it's not a new idea at all. It's just you haven't read the paper. I pulled out these 2 things on the frequency of these patients per month and the duration in hours. The peak being somewhere between 1 to 4, not entirely surprising. And the duration largely distributed over about 48 hours. Where did that information end up? I think this ended up very much driving the thinking of the first and of the International Classification of Headache Disorders in the mid-1980s. Ollison was chairing. Ollison was a hard taskmaster. He chaired the classification committee for about 40 years. And they relied a lot on expert opinion at the time. And it's hard for me not to think that this description and what Jim brought to the table was not just half a dozen observations from last week or what I saw yesterday, but systematic categorization and thinking about clinical neurology. There's so much obsession sometimes with tests and doing things, poking needles in biomarkers, whatever, where the careful history remains just one of the probably the most important aspect in our armamentarium. And I pulled these pictures from the 1960 paper. Not much has changed, you might say. You might say nothing has changed. So, as is described in his various biographies, Jim was interested in research at a fairly certainly very junior stage, certainly while he was an RMO, and he wanted to do research training. At first, he asked some luminary that was visiting from the UK at the time, who advised he and another fellow called Harris, I think, to go to Oxford and do a course and research and so forth. Jim wasn't inspired by what he saw he went to Melbourne and wasn't inspired by what he saw. His colleague, Harris, I think was the name, was inspired, ended up in Oxford, ended up actually as the Regis Professor of Medicine in Oxford, had quite a successful career in that regard. Jim clearly wanted to do something inquiring, something physiology's clearly grabbed him. He was at home there, I think. And he met Peter Bishop, who is pictured here, who'd just established a brain research unit, Neurology, at the University of Sydney. I've reproduced there one of the pictures from the 1954 paper on the pyramidal tract. On the left, A and B are intact pyramidal tract evoked potentials, and on the right, after lesion, after a period of time, to show that this is where the tract went. And there are things we take for granted now that you could do with other methodologies, and this must have been really difficult to get these plates out. And I know the attention to detail that he took to figures, even when they were easier to make. I can't imagine how difficult this was to do. Peter Bishop was a medical and had thought about doing neurosurgery. Actually, was going to Clark for Charles Simons in London, but decided he wanted to do bench research and ended up in Sydney establishing this his laboratory. And Jim did his MD, which you should think of as a PhD for physicians. It's not a bit of a simplification of what it is, but typically clinicians at this point would do an MD after their MBBS. So think of it as doing a PhD, and it was obviously a very basic science PhD, using the cat as a model, as many physiologists had done. That derives from Sherrington, I think, who had used cat and had influenced Eccles and Derek Denny Brown. I've got a book, which is the most extraordinary book, which is written by Eccles, Denny Brown, and Sherrington, because most of you who know the history will know that Denny Brown was in London and then ended up in the US at Boston City, where he influenced Raymond D. Adams. It's a very, very small world when you think about neurology. And Eccles, of course, Nobel laureate, who ended up influencing so many neurophysiologists around the world, including those in Australia and in part with Peter Bishop. Lance wrote, is reported by, he wrote himself, I should say, but he wrote Peter Bishop's obituary, the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience. It's a little reference there. It's not a bad read. And he wrote, Lance wrote of Bishop, when did I decide to take up neurology and why? Well, the answers to both of these questions lay in my meeting with Peter Bishop in 1950. My first and lasting impression of him was one of intense enthusiasm. And when I read that, I thought, wow, push forward 30 odd years, a little bit less than 30 odd years. And I remember the first time I saw Jim Lance speak. There are some things you just remember. And I was in the Clancy Auditorium at University of New South Wales. I was a second year medical student. So that was, I'm going to date myself now, I was in 1978, remembering, of course, that I went there from high school, but there we go, 1978. The Clancy Auditorium is one of those huge auditoriums. All the medical students would come together for these lecture series, sort of clinical studies lecture series. And it was a sort of physiological clinical studies lecture series. And Lance unsurprisingly, gave the neurology lectures. And I used to sit up the back on the right side. I would sit. Didn't feel terribly engaged. I didn't enjoy medical school, I have to say at the start. And I was sitting up there, and Lance gave a talk about, among other things, the non-dominant parietal lobe syndromes, anosognosia and such things. and he was so engaging. I have to tell you, it was, if I had a biblical analogy, it'd be Paul on the road struck. I don't see myself as Paul. Don't say it that way. But he was so engaging. Totally the top of his game. Totally understanding how to take the physiology that was being described. Mountcastle, Bernard Mountcastle described in the Journal of Physiology the behavior of neurons in the parietal lobe of monkey, and how to translate that into thinking about a patient sitting in a bed who drew half the side of a clock. And I thought, I thought it was just amazing. I'd barely been in the library at the university, I have to admit. I spent most of my time at lunchtime when I was first at the university going to the outside the front of the library, trying to wind up the art students because I thought they were clowns, basically. I was a bit naughty. I know I was naughty at the time, but I used to wind. I never went in the library. But after I saw this, I went and found this Mountcastle paper. And when Mountcastle came to Australia, I actually snuck into the Australian Physiology and Pharmacology APPS meeting when he was there without paying because I didn't have much money, and I thought it'd be okay. So I was a bit naughty. So and listened to Mountcastle. It was great research, but Jim brought it alive in a way, and I'll never forget that lecture. And I'm certainly that when I think about why did I decide to take up neurology, it was when I was just sitting there listening to him. And the other thing was that my first and lasting impression of Jim Lance was one of intense enthusiasm about what he was doing. You could see from that clip that he was enthusiastic about everything. He was enthusiastic about life. In its many, he was enthusiastic about good wine, enthusiastic about his children, enthusiastic about his research, enthusiastic about clinical work. He was just an enthusiast. So I was struck that I could just lift his words, put Jim Lance in there, and that would be the basis for how I got interested. So let's move on a little bit. Clinical training, research training. He did the MD on the pyramidal tract of the cat. He wanted to do further training. At the time, you couldn't get on a flight easily, just fly to London. That wasn't a thing. So he went to London on the SS Orcades. David Burke again notes that because he wasn't in the union, he couldn't get a salary. So he had to work as a ship's doctor for nothing except the passage to go to London. I mean, that is intense, really, the fact that you have to get on a boat and go if you want to get trained. But he realised he wanted to do more neurology training. And in 1955, he was a house physician at the National Hospital. He also done some work at the Royal Postgraduate Medical School at Hammersmith. That must have been hard. I don't mean to diss anyone when I say this, but when I was even at the National, the guys that had been at the Hammersmith used to refer to it as the Hammersmith House of Horrors. Everything was so intense, so intense. He notes, Jim Lance notes Swithin Meadows as one of his there's the formative teacher that was there. He noted that he told me once Chris Earle was still active there. Chris Earle was active when I was there, and that many of the luminaries, including Critchley, Donald Critchley, were active. He came back to Australia, worked at the Northcote Neurological Centre, realising he needed more neurology training. Very insightful, understood that he needed to get more. Got a Lilly Fellowship, as it was at the time, and in 1958 went to Mass General and trained with Raymond D. Adams. And American colleagues will recognise Raymond Adams' name as Adams and Victor the book, and recognise Raymond Adams' name and training at Mass General as just one of the things that it was pivotal in the formation of academic neurology in the US. He wrote, as I mentioned in that clip, on post-hypoxic myoclonus, what one could call Lance Adams syndrome more correctly, and wrote on action tremor in Parkinson's disease. He was very much at this stage engaged in work on movement disorders. He I've got the next one. He received a number of awards. He came back to Australia after that. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. He came back to Australia after that, and came back as the first academic neurologist, first real neurologist really appointed to a hospital to do such things, and was appointed as chairman of neurology, as a senior lecturer, and rose to personal chair over the 30-odd years that he ran the Department of Neurology at Prince Henry and Prince of Wales. But he was situated at Prince Henry, and it was a beautiful place. Clinical Sciences Building was a wonderful place to be working. The Vista, he had a wonderful working relationship with the nursing staff, with the senior neurosurgeon, Alec Gonski. Wonderful collaborative time to be in neurology, neurosurgery. As I mentioned, he won a number of awards in his life. The Wolf Award of the American Headache Society, that's their most important award. The Arnold Friedman Award. He was president of the Australian Association of Neurologists, perhaps unsurprisingly, founding president of the Australian Headache Society, which he whipped the troops into shape to found, to run the 1989 International Headache Congress. As Lisa said, there was a time when people travelled, and back then everyone came to Australia in headache. Everyone came to Sydney for the Congress. Such was Jim's place in the headache world, that the headache world came to the mountain and came to Sydney. Spectacular meeting. He was president of the International Headache Society, where he helped in many things. His drive on the classification committee, and he's quite influential in getting cephalalgia into order in terms of having ownership passed to the International Headache Society from where it had been set up, the Norwegian Headache Society. He was very patient at doing those sorts of things. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, he received a 2015, from memory, a Lifetime Achievement Award of the International Headache Society. Meeting was in Valencia, and he came along. And I had the privilege of speaking about his work in headache at the time. And an almost greater privilege, I have to say, I hosted a dinner and got together as many younger people as I could who were interested in headache to sit and talk to him about it. And I have to say that, unsurprisingly, he was just in his absolute element, giving advice and listening to junior people about the thoughts that they had around headache, treating them all, of course, as if all their ideas were just as good as any other, and it was a lesson to be learned. FAA is the Fellowship of the Australian Academy. As I said, it's like, I don't mean to irritate anyone by saying it's like getting an FRS, I suppose. Maybe nothing's like getting an FRS. So the National Science Academy. You see the details of this. This is David Burke writing in the historical records of Australian science. It's easy to find if you just look up James W. Lance and Burke. You'll see this comes up. David did a really good job setting all this out. This was the citation that the Academy of Science gave. You have to think back when this was done that there aren't that many. If you're a practicing clinician, getting into a science academy, that is a tall order, because it's a funny thing. Those of you who've been involved in bench research will understand this. If you're doing research as a clinician, the clinical people are slightly suspicious that you're really not really the business. And if you're doing clinical work, the research people wonder where you are when you're not in the labs, like you're doing nothing. But you're always doing something. It's a very complex thing to get this combination. And Lance, the citation is wonderful. Contributions to neurology, fantastic, particularly in respect to disorders of the motor system and headache. And it just goes to show you the breadth. Who'd think that someone would write about post-hypoxic myoclonus would also write about migraine? Who would think that? Jim did the things he thought were interesting. He didn't do the things that were just fashionable. Attainments including the elucidation of mechanisms, nature of myoclonus, akinetic attacks in epilepsy, the cogwheel phenomenon in Parkinson's disease, the mechanism of reflex irradiation in spasticity, the description and investigation of the tonic vibration reflex, leading to a completely new method for investigating normal and disordered motor controls, work that David Burke really amplified. His contributions to our understanding of headache mechanisms, a whole other paragraph. Studies of vasoactive amines, hormones, prostaglandins, and monographs on the mechanism and management of headache, which still remains. I was fortunate enough, he asked me to join one of the editions of this. It remains one of my top 10 cited things, not because anything I wrote, but because he's just had such an insight into clinical problems that people still cite it, incorporating his own contributions, of course, translated into French, Italian, Portuguese, and Japanese, and I've seen a translation into Polish, I think, as well. Extraordinary influence. As I said in the piece that I did for the thesis meeting, 300 papers in the typewriter era. That is a whole other thing. I mean, that is really, it's not like the nothing like the Word and EndNote era. He did research in the 60s when that was not a thing, really. Not a thing for a clinician, man. It's just not a thing for a clinician to do. He would see patients and he was teaching students. The students, everyone would be on the round and engaged in the process. And of course, he had an experimental headache laboratory in the pre-triptan era when that was certainly not a thing. As I said, he wrote about Lance-Adams syndrome. Extraordinary across the things he was interested in. Form, visual hallucinations. Wonderful paper in Brain on that. The case of the 500 cases of migraine. He wrote about the red ear syndrome. One of his famous quips was he described this red ear syndrome at the Australian Association of Neurologists, and began his talk by asking his assembled colleagues to lend them their red ears. Very nice illusion. He was interested in headache related to sexual activity. You had to be, you understand, you have to be pretty respectable to start writing about that. But he could take a history from someone with sexual headache and it didn't feel weird. Sometimes there are subjects which can get weird easily. He characterized the build-up type of headache and the orgasmic type of headache. Wonderful. Pivotal in the international classification of headache disorders. It's like kept in the family, so to speak. I've just taken over about a year and a half ago, pre-COVID, so it seems like just yesterday, as chairman of that committee. His influence is all over it. He described the Harlequin syndrome, lateralized flushing, telling me that came up with the name because one of his children had a toy that looked like that. And, only a really rounded human being is prepared to name a syndrome after their children's toys. In the first clinical trial of methisergide, he was into clinical trials in the long before that had become fashionable. The methisergide is now dead, but the pharmacology was quite important. He described work at serotonin, changes in migraine. Pat Humphrey, who synthesized first sumatriptan, the father of the triptans, told me that he visited Jim when he was looking around to ask questions as the program was going on to develop triptans. Visited Jim in Sydney and was told, Jim told him about his research and so on and so forth. And Humphrey told me that of the people he talked to, Jim was really at the top drawer of clinicians who were convincing in their scientific discussion of their subject matter. You've got to think back about migraine in the early 80s. This was not a subject of terribly much science. He led the first placebo-controlled trial of sumatriptan done in Australia, published in the Lancet. I executed some of it, but he really drove Glaxo to do a crossover study when they seriously didn't want to at all, which showed his influence. And he gave the Wartenberger Lecture of the American Academy of 1980, and I particularly single it out. I take it a figure from it there, reflex irradiation. every time I see teach a new neurology resident or have someone that want to talk about clinical examination, I'll point out this paper to them, which to this day I think remains one of probably the most lucid explanation of what's happening with the physiology of reflexes and to the irradiation of reflexes. It is a remarkable statement about Jim's academia, that things he wrote in the 80s are as useful teaching today as they were in 1980. This is also a picture I alluded to in that talk I gave for TISA. These are the books, Physiological Approach to Clinical Neurology. That was his thing. It was like, how does it work? Physiological approach. I was walking down a street in New York, as you do, when I was there doing a postdoc with Don Rees at Cornell. I was walking down with one Constantino Iadacola, who's currently chairman at Cornell. In his younger days, Cos was doing a postdoc there. And he was walking with him was Betsy Ross, Elizabeth Ross, who'd recognise, those of you in the US are recognised from the American Neurological Association fame. Subsequently, they were married. And Constantino introduced me to Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross was at Mass General at the time. And she asked me where I'd be, and I'd come from Australia, and Lance was the mentor. And she turned to me quite spontaneously, Betsy Ross, and said, "Oh, Professor Adams says that Dr. Lance was one of his very best students and wrote probably the best book on neurology in terms of physiology, this physiological approach to clinical neurology." It's quite a big thing to say spontaneously coming from Ray Adams. And of course, he wrote the headache books, which I was involved in some of them, and a book for patients. And as I said before, what you see on there, Jim on the top left, you see Paul Spire on the left, you see Peter Drummond, Zandrino Zagami, David Burke. You see Mike Welsh, you see Aziz Sonawala, you see Anand from Thailand, you see David Burke, you see smiling people, including myself, and I see John Duckworth with a beard, and I see Zandrino Zagami. He had a beard there. I won't tell you which of his it is, and there's me with a mustache, which I happily got rid of sometime after. The common theme in Jim's lab was, and the common theme, I say it, of headache people, and I don't think it's because of headache so much as training. When I look at this, the common theme there is people are smiling. And because Jim created an environment that was intellectually satisfying, clinically spectacular, and it was happy. And that's a place that people wanted to work. So Jim Lance, MD, he was a doctor, and he was an academic, a scientist, and his CBE for services to the community. He was also a children's book author. This is the Golden Trout. He got together stories that he told his children and wrote a book, the Golden Trout. There aren't that many professors of neurology who can write a physiological approach to clinical neurology, understand reflexes, and tell a good children's story. In the lab, we used to think that this was an allegorical tale of neurology, and we tried to work out who was who, but I think it was just a good children's book. That line diagram, the line drawing, caricature is actually rather good. It's in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it describes, and when his obituary appeared there, and it says a lot about Jim. He liked to sit on his pipe. In the later days, he weren't allowed to smoke in the hospital, but he would pull the pipe out and put it in his mouth at any rate. And in a slightly naughty way, like people to come around, and particularly administrative people, and sort of say, "You're not smoking, are you?" And he would just never light it up, but he'd have it in his mouth. He quite liked doing that. There are three things I would say if I talked about describing Jim Lance. His daughter described him at his funeral as unfailingly polite. You don't get many people like that these days. It doesn't matter how stupid someone was, or how difficult they were, or how difficult anything situation was. He was unfailingly polite. I was walking with him in Mossman, in Paddington, one time I visited him, we were having lunch and we were walking. We were walking into a restaurant. He liked going to Italian restaurants. Loved Italy. Loved the whole environment. Loved staying with Secretary. And we stopped. And a person came up to him quite spontaneously and looked at him. He said, "You're Jim Lance, aren't you?" Jim said, "Oh yeah, yes, the one, yes." And he said, "You changed my son's life." And he went on to describe what he'd done for his son. And that's what he did for patients. He changed their lives by his practice. And I would say that for me, he made me what I am. So to talk about Jim, it gives me a sheer pleasure. If I'd been at all successful, I would have been nothing if I hadn't seen him speak. If I've not got into neurology, I never would have been inspired. I probably would have done something completely stupid. I would have done economics or some other dumb thing. I don't know what I would have done. He changed lives. Medicine is about changing lives, and he changed them for the better. And that's what medicine is about. So when I think about inspiring people in clinical neuroscience, I think about Jim Lance because he inspired people and he changed their lives. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that fantastic, very moving speech. You were absolutely right. I remember vividly before I entered into formal neurology training from New Zealand, I can't remember the exact year. I remember ringing somebody in Auckland, and when the person heard my name, "So you wanted to do neurology? No, you can't do neurology here with that sort of a surname." I won't tell you the year. And then at the same year, because of my desire to do neurology, I attended one of the AN meetings somehow, and I bumped onto Professor Lance. And it is quite extraordinary how welcoming and how generous and how supportive he is. You're absolutely right. Medicine is about changing life and changing life for better. Thank you very much. I might invite some of the other panel members to make some comments. Professor Sandrino Sagami is here, and he used to be very close to Professor Lance. Sandrino, are you able to share some of your thoughts with us on this amazing human being who changed so many lives all over the world, certainly in Australia? We might get back to Sandrino when he is ready.
I see Anand's online.
Yes, I know. Let's go to the Anand, and he was trying to get into this meeting like 3-4 hours ago. Anand, are you very warm welcome back again? Are you able to share some of your thoughts of this great human being?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful moment. I would say that I know the name of Jim Lance from his book when I was a neurology resident. And I met him for the first time when he came to Bangkok to give lectures. At the time, I tried to find the place for me to pursue my research, and because I'm so interested in headache. And so I applied to the International Headache Society for the fellowships. And at the time that I tried to submit my application, I had no idea that I have to find the lab that accept me. So I was quite desperate at the times, and I decided to write to Jim Lance, the people that are actually at that time he didn't know me at all. And that was the first year that he just retired from his professorship in Sydney. But anyway, he was kind enough to pass my letter to Michael Anthony's, and that moment really changed my life. I did get the scholarship from International Headache Societies and started curious in doing research in headaches that I pursued for that time to now. And I would say that that's it. Like Peter Gosby just said, he did change the life, and I didn't think that I only know for everything, and he's the one that made me become a headache researcher until today. So yeah, and thanks to you, Jim. Thank you so much.
Anand, thank you very much for that. Those of you who do not know him, he is a giant in headache medicine field in this part of the world, from Thailand, and he is indeed the dean of one of the very best medical schools in Thailand also, and he keeps himself active. And I come across one of his recent publications on trying to explain pathophysiology of medication overuse headache. So thank you so much for joining in with a very short notice.
And not just that part of the world. I mean, Anand's won the Wolf Award of the American Headache Society. Not a part of the world. Anand's on the global stage. I mean, it's worthwhile saying that. Jim propelled a lot of people forward. So Anand's a Wolf Award winner as well, I'm sure. I just wanted to say that. No, it's true. I mean, you know, the Southeast Asia should not be a blushing bride to the rest of the world when good research is done. And as you say, sorry to interrupt you, TC, but I thought I should point that out.
No, I totally agree. What I said, that this part of the world is where he is living. Of course, he is the global leader. Thank you for pointing this out and making it crystal clear in Jim's way, basically. Peter, you are basically living the dream of how his students should be. We might now invite Professor Regina. I remember you were talking about Jim fondly since I bumped onto you some years back. And again, thank you so much for joining with a very short notice.
Right. First of all, I have to congratulate my colleague, and I can call him Professor Peter Godsby. And actually, he was ahead of me in rotating with Professor James Land. So I could call him as Professor James Land Jr. I think he is the best one to, after Professor James Land. And I have invited him several times, remember, Professor Peter here in the Philippines. And the same holds true with Professor James Lance. He came to the Philippines twice. I was able to know him because I'm since childhood, I've been having headache and migraine. So I tried to research on how I could be with him. And so because of the fact that I want to go to the clinical neurology, I started first with neuropathology under Byron Kakulas in Perth. And this is through the Australian scholarship program. And then I transferred to him in Sydney. And I invited him twice here in the Philippines. And all I can recall is, he was really a very great man whom we respect. But what I could remember is after the lecture, I had to bring him around in Manila. And I always remember him because in Manila, I think Peter knows that it's so crowded and people don't follow in the street. For one or two cars, there will be 18 motorcycles in between. So what I could fondly remember about Professor Lance is whenever we are on the road, he will shout, woo, 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 like, I'll meet an accident, because he is so scared about the traffic situations in the Philippines. But he's really, I really admire him very much. Thank you. I always get an updated book. And in my lecture on headaches, being a president of the Philippine Headache Society, and I started the Headache Council of the Philippine Neurological Association. At the end of my talk, I always quote their sayings of Professor Jameson and Professor Peter Godsby, that migraine does not destroy life. It only destroys the joy of living. That's I always end up my lecture on headaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. I might move to Professor Luigi Kaji, the next. I know Luigi's main heart and soul is in neurophysiology, just like Professor Wolfgang Grisold, who has neuro-otology, neuro-oncology also. But you told me once that one of Jim's books changed your life. So let's stick to Peter's theme, we are about changing life for better, which is quite apt given the current crazy pandemic that we are in globally with one single global enemy. Professor Kaji, share your experience about this great man.
Thank you, Tisa, and thank you also to Peter. And I was quite moved by the story that Peter has given to all of us. In fact, I met Jim only once at the AOCN meeting in Melbourne almost 10 or 12 years ago, and which I was given an assignment of Asia Initiative to activate Asian regional WFN societies. And so I was just at the restaurant, and I saw him because I knew him by his photograph. And I was a very enthusiastic reader of his book, Physiological Approach to Clinical Neurology. And I just introduced myself, and he seems to be quite much astonished. And then he introduced himself quite modestly to myself. I was just nobody to him. And I said to him, I'm an enthusiastic reader of your book. And then he replied, what a wonderful story. And that's the only conversation I made. He sat just at the one corner of the restaurant alone, and I just sat on the other corner of the restaurant alone. So just one-time conversation. And naturally, I wanted to take picture with him, but that was too kind of robust a wish for me at the time. And then I sat quietly at the opposite corner of the restaurant. But anyway, I still use his book for teaching medical students. For example, if you have exaggerated triceps jerk, then biceps is depressed usually. If biceps is exaggerated, and then triceps depressed. And patellar tendon reflex is exaggerated, and then Achilles tendon reflex is depressed, or vice versa. If there's no known explanation for that, I usually teach medical students, this is the Schiff-Sherrington phenomenon. You have to refer to Jim's textbook. And I still don't know what Schiff-Sherrington's phenomenon refers to, but that's a very good indication that a common neurophysiology, that the adjacent segment deep tendon reflexes just inhibit reciprocally. And then one is depressed and the other is exaggerated. So just clinical observation of that, of course, comes from this book in my mind. And so I thought he is a neurophysiologist, before becoming the world-known headache specialist, but probably I'm wrong. But his background is quite now clear to me after Peter's talk. Thank you for just inviting me to join. And thank you, Peter, for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaji. For those youngsters who might come back to this video later on through WFN YouTube channel, I strongly encourage you to the paper that Peter recommended as 1980 Wurtemberg lecture, which is available through Neurology journal that you can download through a subscription.
Oh.
It's a brilliant paper. And if you can't get hold of the book that Professor Kaji's mentioned, I strongly recommend you to read that. If you can't get hold of that, you can email me quietly and I'll send you a PDF to you. Let's move to Professor Wolfgang Grisold. Wolfgang, you may or may not have worked with Professor Lance or knew him, but given your work in World Federation Neurology, what Peter mentioned, it is about changing life for better, which is what advocacy is about, which is what World Federation Neurology is about. You could see the amazing amount of synergy and inclusiveness that Prof. Lance had when you look at the variety of faces and people that he trained and inspired. So I want you to comment on his legacy and bring how this is directly in line with the WFNA. Of course, late Professor Lance was a vice president of World Federation Neurology in the past. As I recall, as I wrote his obituary to World Neurology, including Bill Carroll and Sandrino, who is in the panel. Thanks, Wolfgang.
Tisa, thank you. And I'm very honored and very humbled to be able to say something. Unfortunately, I did not meet him, but I was greatly impressed by Peter's talk. And changing lives is one of the things that we all neurology are trying to do for the better, of course. And I think this is also one part of advocacy that we are increasingly trying to promote with the World Federation of Neurology. So I think I feel very much inspired by the talk. I also missed a lot of things, as Tisa said. Also have an electrophysiologic background, and I worked with the tonic vibration reflex for a long time in Parkinson patients. And I did not know it was from Dr. Lance, so I will look it up again and look at it. So thank you very much for this global and enlightening story of Professor Lance. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Marianne, you represent World Federation Neurology trustees in this panel. Would you like to share some of your thoughts with us? Thank you so much for joining. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I echo the words of Ryuichi and Wolfgang. I very much enjoyed the talk by Professor Goatsby, and I think that Professor Lance was really a giant in neurology. Unfortunately, I never met him, but of course, as has been said before, both Professor Lance and Professor Goatsby are the leading authorities in headache. So I read his book. I very much enjoyed that, and I am very honored that I could join this session of inspiring people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Sagami seems to be unmuted now. You were as close as Peter to the Prof. Lance for a long period of time. Are you in a position to talk to us, Professor Sagami? we seems to have some technical difficulties. Text me, Sandro, if you are hearing me or if you have a problem. Ravi, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Tessa. I have 4 slides to show. Can I just share my screen?
Go for it.
Thank you, Tessa. And that was a brilliant coverage by Peter on the life of this great neurologist, Professor Lance. And we in India did not have a direct close exposure to him, but we grew up and did our post-graduation reading his articles, and we always held him in great awe for the numerous rare and uncommon headache entities that he described. So you can imagine my apprehension and delight when for the first time, this is my first poster presented at the IHC Amsterdam in 1997. And I suddenly find that Professor Jim Lance walks up and starts reading the poster and asks me questions about it. And the topic of that poster was on the coexistence of migraine and cluster features. And of course, that was 1997. Subsequently, Peter has clarified a lot with wonderful articles on this same topic. But at that time, I found it that such a great man, he was so modest that he alluded to the same paper which Peter has talked about, the 500 cases. And he remarked that this is an interesting observation because in our 500 patients, we surprisingly did not encounter any autonomic features. And you have also got some patients who had migraine at one point of time and cluster headache at another point of time. So I thought that for such a great man to be noticing this small point was also very encouraging for us. The next occasion when I got to know him more closely was when we held the first headache meeting in India in the year 2000. And thanks to my teacher, Dr. Noshir Wadia, who was a close friend of Jim Lance, he insisted that we make an impact with this first meeting because headache is an emerging subspecialty. And unless we have Jim Lance as part of the faculty, our neurologists would not be interested in attending. So we shifted the date of the meeting to accommodate the convenience of Professor Lance. And we had a wonderful faculty, which included Professor Lance, Professor Solomon, and Nainan Matthew. And it was a packed first headache meeting with 200 neurologists in attendance in the year 2000, when headache was still an emerging subspecialty, not what it is today. So you can well imagine the impact that Jim Lance had on the audience because everybody had grown up reading his articles. And during the 3 days that I spent with him, I got to know him very closely. I had enough opportunities to discuss many headache issues with him and also to keep on asking him how he got the ideas for his research. And a lot of that wisdom I have put down and we have recorded it in the proceedings of this symposium, which was brought out. But there is one incident which I would like to narrate here, which is beyond his academic brilliance. It shows what a kind man he was. And that is when some young neurologist who was a postgraduate went up to him and, not having read his articles and papers, he bluntly asked him, "Can I have your visiting card, Dr. Lance?" So to me, I thought that was not in order. So while Dr. Lance started searching his pockets, I told the young man that I will give you the details later. So I sent him away. But during lunchtime, which was about 4 hours later, I was sitting with Dr. Lance and he asked me, can you locate the young man who wanted my visiting card? I want to meet him. And so when I managed to locate him at the other corner of the dining room, Professor Lance, we walked together. He went to the young man and said, Doctor, you wanted my visiting card. Here it is. And so he remembered, he went up to his room, got his visiting card, and gave it to the young neurologist, who did not probably know what a great man Jim Lance was. And lastly, when he reached back to Australia after the meeting, this is the nice message that he wrote to me. And ever since then, for every new year, unfailingly, from such a senior person, I would get a New Year card. And that was very touching for me. And I thought that this man, as Peter has narrated, was not only academically brilliant, but I think his greatness extended beyond that. And as also Peter has said, I think he believed very strongly in creating an environment which was happy for everybody to work with. We will really miss him. Thank you, Tisa, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for those wonderful remarks. The greatness and humility always stay together. And our main speaker, Professor Godsby, is another telling example, just as you shown about Prof. Lance. Professor Marco Medina, we would love to hear from you also, if you could say us a few words. Professor Medina is the Secretary General of this special subsection of World Federation Neurology Special Interest Group, who will be the next, the main speaker for the next session also.
I think there is some problem with this connection.
Professor Meshram, you wanted to say some concluding remarks?
Yeah, I think we have missed, I think Professor Gerald has also left. And I think we had a very wonderful session. And Peter, knew Professor Jim so well, and he said so many things would really inspire everyone. And people have joined here. People have joined on the YouTube live also for today's session. And I would like to thank Professor Peter for this wonderful talk and for being with us and sparing time. And I would like to thank Tisa for, getting in touch with so many panelists and helping me to, get their contacts, and they could join for this panel, and also communicate with Peter. And Dr. Ravi Shankar was also, suggested this to have this session on Jim Lance, and he could get in touch with Professor Peter. So it was a wonderful session, and I would like to thank, Professor Anand, Regina, Professor Zagami, and Professor Bill Carroll, President WFN, has also joined, but he had another call, so he left. And same is true with Professor Raj Shakir. And would like to thank Professor Marian and Professor Griswold, Professor Yuji Kazi, Marco Medina, and Regina. I think it was a wonderful session, and my friend Dr. Gagandeep, who is Singh, who is a past president of the past secretary of Indian Academy of Neurology and president of Indian Academy of Neurology, Professor J.M.K. Murthy. So I'd like to thank everyone for being with us for this important session, and we look forward to this series in the next month on 4th September, where Marco Medina would speak about Professor Ted Munsart. So it is another great session we are looking forward to. And then in the month of October, we will not have a session because on the first week of October, we have a World Congress of Neurology. But in November, we'll have a session and that will be about Michel Dumas. So we'll meet on 4th September. And I would like to once again thank you everyone for this wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Meshram, I just need to remind people one last thing. The World Brain Day campaign still continuing, so we would encourage our colleagues to visit World Federation Neurology World Brain Day website and the promote World Brain Day activities in your region. We wanted to pass 100 million mark, and thank you very much once again for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay safe and well. Bye.
Thank you. Ang cute talaga.
Thank you, Bhavesh.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure.